Welcome to our second deCordova Live Lunchtime Conversation. I am Sam Adams, the Koch Curatorial Fellow at deCordova, and I'm here with artist Rachel Mica Weiss, who has just installed a new work in deCordova's Sculpture Park. You are all invited to visit the sculpture, as we are now open 7 days a week with timed entry purchased ahead. During today's conversation, please submit any questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask as many as we can at the end. Until then, please feel free to engage with each other using the comments feature. Rachel Mica Weiss is a sculptor and installation artist who carves stone, casts concrete, and makes immersive installations composed of thousands of thread suspended in air. In each medium, Weiss forces herself to relinquish some of the control that she craves, even while indulging the impulse through meticulous planning and a masterful understanding of her materials. Weiss joins us from her Pittsburgh studio today, but is also partly based in Brooklyn, New York. She holds a BA from Oberlin College and an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute, with further studies at the Maryland Institute College of Art and Haystack Mountain School of Craft in Maine. Weiss has created public art for the U.S. Embassy in Kyrgyzstan, Airbnb Seattle, the Pittsburgh International Airport, among other venues. Her work has been the subject of solo exhibitions at Carnegie Mellon University, Lux Art Institute, LMAC Gallery and Friedman Gallery in New York, and the San Francisco Arts Commission. Weiss is coming off multiple residencies and has just accepted a grant from the Heinz Endowments, the Pittsburgh Foundation, and the Opportunity Fund, which provides generous support for her project at deCordova. Congratulations, Rachel. Now in its 11th year, the platform series allows deCordova curators to work with several early and mid-career artists to develop temporary projects for the park each summer. They are intended to advance discussions of contemporary sculpture by experimenting with new methods and materials, or working on scales not ordinarily possible. Weiss's sculpture, The Wild Within, surpasses these ambitions in ways we will hear about shortly, and is the 27th work in the series. Rachel, working with you on this project throughout quarantine has been a ray of light. Thank you for sharing yourself and your work with deCordova. Thank you as well to each of you for logging in and sharing this time with us. I want to acknowledge deCordova's artistic director, John Ravenal, and senior curator, Sarah Monteros, for their support of this project, as well as an anonymous donor. Thanks especially to my colleagues for helping with this event behind the scenes, Elizabeth Upenix and Megan Lawton. And finally, I'm proud to share that Rachel's installation is officially aligned with the Feminist Art Coalition, which is an initiative among curators across the U.S. to display an abundance of art by femme-identified artists ahead of the 2020 election. Rachel, I wanted to begin this discussion by hearing about your process. The Wild Within is the latest in your series of cast concrete pieces called Folds. Can you describe how you make these works, and then The Wild Within, your largest to date?
It began with this little clay model, which I made out of this rigid clay. And we ultimately, with the help of this incredible fabrication firm, Visionary Effects, 3D scanned it and extruded it, which is the image that you're seeing on the left, and then 3D printed it with the plinth to scale, which is the image that you're seeing on the right. And then after that, which is our next slide. And then of course there was the plinth that was, you can see that on the left, that was fabricated by Wheaton and Sons here in Pittsburgh. This huge 10-foot long by 4 foot wide by 3 foot tall plinth. And then let's actually jump forward a slide and then we can jump back. So I'll just show you on the left that there was this huge process of making the mold. So on the left is the interior of this master form that you're seeing, basically the rectangle that I contorted that makes up the body. So this very perfect rectangle had to be created and then sanded ad nauseum. And then that was ultimately cast into a mold, which is the previous image, this sort of big latex bag almost, which is what we cast into. And to get that specific curvature of the form, we created this mold bed. And so to get that mold bed, all of these different slot together curved parts were put together in this puzzle, which I think is in the next slide. In this grid, and that's just half of the grid. There were 2 of those that fit together, and we lay our rubber mold over the bed and then cast in concrete, which is that sort of drippy pre-colored material that you're looking at, which really is tough to manage, wants to just flow where gravity takes it and slide down the side. And so we had this limited amount of time, myself and 3 amazing assistants, to basically create this Jackson Pollock-y painting in the surface and ultimately fill that 5-inch thick mold before all of the concrete cured.
Rachel, can you describe some of the risks you took or some of the steps that were different than in your smaller folds? So making this fold on the largest scale ever for deCordova, what did it entail in terms of you taking some risks or changing your process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at a large scale like this, there are no tests. I mean, the scale of the work really fundamentally changes how it's made. In previous works, I was able to move the object around myself or with the help of an assistant. This fold weighs a ton, it weighs 2,000 pounds. And so just the way of handling it is so different. And I don't know how 5 inches thick of concrete is going to behave until we do it. I can make some assumptions based on my experience, but there is this, there is this risk of not knowing how it's going to behave. And then of course, in that process of sort of painting the concrete into the mold, I'm creating that image or that flowing surface upside down. So I can't really see what I'm doing. And I think when I'm working at a smaller scale, that risk feels manageable in that, hey, if I don't like it, I can try it again. There isn't this massive amount of resources that would be wasted. So I think the huge risk here was just that it was just a one-shot process. And so it felt like there was a lot of pressure on that one day when we cast everything, because all of the steps led up to that. And then, as Sam and I will discuss later, the content of the piece and the concept behind the piece changed sort of late in the game, and I added this huge 650-pound boulder. So even just this simple act of putting that physically on top of the form was a risk in and of itself. And we tested that in the studio to make sure that it would hold, but if it didn't, I don't know what we would have done.
So now that the work is installed, it looks gorgeous, and there's no backseas. So the concrete cures you left it for almost an entire week, even though it only takes 72 hours, right? And then there must have been such anticipation for the demolding process. When you demolded, was there any square inch of this incredible, huge piece that you said like, oh no, that's not what it was supposed to look like?
So where she sort of sits up and her torso sits up, we cast that element elevated, and then when the casting was finished, we dropped it down. And so there was this ooze that happened in that fold of this pink material that kind of oozed out and created this weird patch on it. So I ended up doing some faux painting afterwards, which I dare anyone to spot in the park. I think I did a pretty good job. But yeah, so I became a marble faux painter in this process as well.
Well, that's what's sort of incredible about this process, Rachel, is that you worked with, 3 different fabricators, all of these professionals who you wouldn't normally necessarily, it would normally just be you and a team of a couple studio assistants you'd hire for the day. So what I was really impressed watching the entire time is that you kept learning like very intimate tricks of the trade from each of these experts that you were working with in a way that I know you won't need to hire all of them in the future because you've already gleaned so much of their expertise, and myself as well, actually, getting to be along for the ride, but not as intimately as you did. And so just like lastly, would you, if you had an unlimited budget, if you could do it over again with as much time and no constraints, we were working between Pittsburgh and Lincoln, Massachusetts, so this huge distance, would you do anything differently? Is there anything that you learned that you would like to incorporate into a future work of this nature?
I don't know that I would do anything differently, honestly. I mean, I think the casting process I learned a great deal from, and I think even the fabricators who helped to make the molds literally mixed up all of the latex in this huge trash can and had never mixed up that volume of latex before. You know, it was like, it's the mold itself weighs like 300 pounds. And so at volume and scale, materials behave differently than you're used to at smaller quantities. So I don't know that I would have done it differently, but I think I think whatever the next iteration is, and I hope that there is a next iteration, I will be that much more of an expert because I learned so much in the process.
In this work and others, as you mentioned a second ago, you render common materials unrecognizable in a way that I almost want to describe as bewitching, or alchemical maybe, so that concrete, in this case, looks like some sort of bendy marble. Stone looks like ceramic, and steel seems to disappear into its surroundings altogether. So this transformation of materials has made me think back to some precursors in the 70s, like Linda Benglis. We can actually go forward a slide. Sorry, a couple more slides. There we go, thanks. Linda Benglis's poured rubber, Sengen and Goody's stretched pantyhose sculptures, Judy Chicago's resin pieces, or Eva Hesse's. More than a generation later, your bodily but abstract sculpture builds on a rich lineage. Are these important figures for you? Are there others?
Yeah, they are. I mean, I love this image of Linda Benglis. So I think part of this particular time and these artists sort of gaining their voice was asserting their strength through manipulating these unwieldy materials that are typically classed as being masculine materials. And so, you know, I really idolize these women and their work. Eva Hesse was a huge influence. I think Louise Bourgeois really kind of sits as the queen above them all. Françoise Grossin, you know, a lot of those women really are able to manipulate these unwieldy materials and to work in this context between physical space and the body, which I also aim to occupy. You know, of course, like a large part of my practice is dealing in space. You know, you mentioned the large scale. Well, actually, we haven't talked about that yet. You know, I have this large scale installation practice. And so I think both that practice and these women's practices that you mentioned are really encouraging viewers to come at artwork from this place of feeling, not just looking, because there's something sort of like visceral and space oriented going on with these artists' work. And so, yeah, I'm definitely operating in a similar vein as they are.
I hadn't really completely thought about that before in that way, Rachel, that your sculpture is about feeling, not just looking. And it totally makes sense because of its weight, its gravity. You know, after you've perceived it once, you can close your eyes and actually feel it in front of you. That's such a beautiful description. And it also makes me think about some of the super heavy, large scale, either industrial or natural earthen materials that minimalist sculptors, not just women, but across, you know, across the spectrum, were using in the 60s and 70s as another legacy that you seem to be tapping into, which is also really about the body of the viewer and how it sort of engages with the object by circulating and perceiving it in space. So that will create interesting challenges for the installation photographer to convey feeling in a photo.
Yeah.
We can move to the next slide. I thought that we could move from process now into some of the content or politics of the work. And thank you for giving us those, your secrets, your insights into the process, which I think is so layered and fascinating and just so muscular, I think, and so impressive. So The Wild Within, the title of your work, is extremely evocative. I thought we could ask you, what is wild and what is it within? And if you could talk a bit about Henry Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare, on which your sculpture is a variation.
Yeah, let me talk first about the painting, and then I can talk about the poem that inspired the title. So yes, we're looking at the painting now. It's one of many historical paintings that I was looking at of sort of women draped over chaise lounges or kind of staring at the viewer. This one is different in that, to me, it speaks directly to the unconscious and this sort of relationship with the mind and psychology, which has been a long interest of mine in my work. I studied psychology before I decided to become an artist, and it greatly informs the content that I'm interested in. This painting was viewed as being, you know, one of the first sort of psychoanalytically oriented paintings. It was painted before Freud and his ideas came to prominence, but apparently Freud himself loved this painting, and it's basically capturing this woman who is like thrown back in this night sweat almost. You can see her nightgown clinging to her body, her mouth is agape, and she's got this imp or demon that's crouching on her stomach. And there is this sort of sexualized suggestion there that the imp is sort of taking advantage of her in a certain way, and is this really dominating male presence that is occupying her dreams. And that there has been this sort of theory in the Middle Ages that, you know, if you ate certain foods or slept in a certain pose or manner, you would, you know, bring upon yourself these demons or imps that would threaten you in your nightmares. And so, you know, I was really—
And women, Rachel, were particularly viewed by men as susceptible to this, correct? There's a sort of a gendered trope too, right?
Right, which is, you know, to me, very much aligned with what we understand as rape culture, right? Like if you do these certain things, you will invite this oppressive male force to like upon you, like, you know, and therefore it would be your fault. And so yeah, right, these vulnerable women are being sort of descended upon in their dreams. And I really was struck by this sort of like malleability of her body thrown over this chaise lounge. It's so unnatural. She's so contorted. It's almost as if her back is broken. And so in kind of using that same sinuousness and impossible folding of what we expect to be rigid, I abstracted this painting, yet instead of having her sort of thrown back and lifeless and at the whim of this male force that's oppressing her, she's kind of sitting up against it, pushing back against it, you know, in the wild within. And, you know, I think the goal here was to kind of speak to this gravity and this weight and sort of generalized sense of oppression that this imp, you know, elicits in the viewer, but also that I hope that this stone elicits in the viewer. And an interesting fact that I found out while I was researching this painting and its history was that hold stones, which make me think of these sort of scholar stones or objects of meditation, were used and like hung above the bed to ward off nightmares. So the stone is both the sort of evocation of the nightmare and the imp, but also this sort of protective force, and it holds that tension in the work. And so the title was actually drawn from this incredible poem about the same painting by poet Paul Tran, who, Sam, you amazingly introduced me to this poem, and I love it. And I don't know that we'll have time to read it aloud on the Zoom, but it will be reprinted in the brochure that's accompanying this piece at the museum, so you'll be able to get a copy of it if you go. But Tran wonders in the poem whether this imp is the wilderness that waits within me. And I just thought that was such a beautiful line, but also spoke to the sort of complexity and depth of this subject that has been flattened over the course of art history by being represented and idealized in, you know, through the brushstrokes of male painters. I thought it sort of alluded to this depth of being that existed beneath the surface.
I guess, Rachel, can you bring any more clarity to if this wild is an oppressive force from an exterior oppressive force, and yet somehow it's within the woman in this case, how is that different than blaming the victim, essentially? If this wild that oppresses her is from within her, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting tension, and it's something that I've thought about. Quite a bit. I mean, I think of the wild, or the wilderness, if you will, which is from this original line, as like sort of this great expanse and sort of the surface of this concrete form, and like the depth that alludes to, rather than the stone itself. But I mean, I think oppression and is internalized. I mean, and so I think that it's something that can, and you know, self-hatred or self-oppression is a real circumstance that arises out of being in a world in which one is consistently oppressed. And I think that those two things can be really hard to disentangle. And to me, that's different than saying that it's the fault of the oppressed. It's rather that those feelings have been internalized because they're so constantly occurring.
That's so beautiful, Rachel. That it's something that's like, it ails her because it's been internalized, but then at the same time, she's like regurgitating it in some complicated way. It's like of her, but then, you know, being ejected or something. And then Tran, the poet, is gender nonconforming, and in their poem there is actually, I don't think, reference to sex, to the sex assignment of the figures. So it has this sort of sexless, sexual nature to it, like genderless, and so that actually carries over into your sculpture, which is not, you know, identifiable as a person with an age, a race, a gender. There are no breasts. There is no, you know, accentuated genital region, as you see basically when you look through the history of figurative sculpture. So much of it is nude and idealized in this, you know, either ancient Greek way or this sort of like whatever sort of Barbie sort of way. You have offered a sculpture which maintains a sense of sensuality, actually, and touch, tactility, and the body, and as an alluring body that draws the viewer in. And yet it's not a sexualized body. It does not have a vagina or breasts. I mean, it could be equally alluring, basically, regardless of someone's gender orientation or identity or sexual orientation. And actually, do you have anything to say about that? I do have a question about it, actually, but I wanted to.
I think that's right on the money. I mean, I think that's really what I wanted to achieve, and both with the color and the form, to have it be a place where, a feeling place that viewers can identify with and sort of like project their own senses onto, and that like left space open for a multiplicity of identities and, you know, any body, any viewer.
Okay, super interesting, which is so different than looking at a Henry Moore sculpture of an abstracted reclining nude woman, because even though they're very elegant like your sculpture, they're semi-abstracted like your sculpture, they have these very pronounced abdomens and breasts. And so it very quickly sort of roots the reading in that direction of sort of something objectified or sexualized. And in recent years, artists and historians have revisited the significance, not only of, as we're seeing now, Confederate monuments, but of iconic paintings and sculpture, as you're doing, Rachel, through lenses of critical race and gender theory. I was wondering if the wild within might fall into that recuperative category as well, you know, addressing past blind spots or omissions. At one point, you thought of the sculpture as an odalisque, the motif of a reclining harem sex worker, which was central to the Orientalist fantasy, tying sexuality to blackness. Ultimately, you moved away from this notion since the work speaks from your perspective as a white woman to a history not so much of racialized, but of gendered representation. as an aside, I actually am very curious about what it says about abstraction, that it can hold such fluctuations in interpretation. But more generally, I was wondering if you could explain the development of the concept, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I had begun by looking at these images, which are sort of so ingrained in our cultural memory and notions and are so, firmly canonized. And I think what originally drew them to me was this, drew me to them is this gaze that all of these women have, this very confident, self-possessed gaze, especially Manet's Olympia. And, this painting in particular was one of the first in the genre for the subject to really have that sort of confidence. And unlike Titian's painting, this one doesn't have a moralizing message. In Titian's painting, there are these servants sort of rummaging around in this trunk behind the central subject looking for, some clothes to cover her nakedness. And Olympia has this very strong, proud in her sexuality sort of stance, and that strength in her femininity and her sensuality and sexuality was what originally drew me to this painting. But then the more that I researched the sort of odalisque tradition, the more I realized that so many of these white male painters had been, as you perfectly put it, they were existing in this sort of Orientalist fantasy of the time and were basically whitewashing these women who were women of color from these Turkish harems, to which they had never been, and which they were basically creating this fantastical view of. And I just felt like I was not a historian of that tradition, and that it was too problematized and for me as a white woman to begin a conversation on it, I guess. And so, but I felt like as a woman, the space of strength in my identity was a space that I could speak from, and that the work could operate more effectively as this sort of sensual, physical, emotional representation of oppression and this very productive strain and pushing back against that.
I think we can move to forward a slide so that we can see the sculpture. Oops, sorry, that's not it. Yes, sorry. This is a good slide to rest on for a second. And so, Rachel, I do think that this sculpture actually has this sort of timeless quality, which is what you were just describing, of this very elegant and very simple, in a way, abstract sort of concept of this oppressive force, and then this figure taking ownership or agency over it, basically. And I think that gives it this sort of timeless sense. But for me, it's inseparable from the fact that you were making it at this moment of incredible tumult, both the sort of history-making movement for Black lives and spawned by the brutal police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and also the pandemic, the coronavirus, which if you're watching this video online in the future, we're right at the peak of in the US. And so I think all of these factors swirling around, making us so aware of our vulnerability, and especially of our society's most vulnerabilities. I think that for me personally, at least, adheres in the sculpture. And I think every time I see it, I will be brought back to this moment in some way. Although interestingly, those politics don't necessarily filter down into the object in some ways. But for me, it's part of its perception, I guess.
Certainly, and originally this 650-pound obsidian stone wasn't going to be part of it, and I think that in a very direct, simple way, it relates to the burdens that we are all feeling and carrying right now, but also to this hope and striving that we're all engaging in, even in feelings and moments of hopelessness, and pushing back against, illness, oppression, white supremacy, all of the different forms of burden that we're now bearing. So yes, I mean, I think that the work is timeless because I think it speaks to that in a more generalized way and in a less sort of specific way, but it was definitely informed by the moment we're living through. And I think that at least for the foreseeable future, it's going to be viewed through the lens of the moment we're living through.
Yeah, I don't want to linger on the point or belabor it too much, but I personally, watching you from Boston, you in Pittsburgh and New York, I was impressed and inspired to see that at a certain moment where you were getting a lot of attention for your work, you became very self-conscious of it, knowing that this is a moment when people are trying nationwide to dismantle white supremacy in a really serious way, and that to take up oxygen in the room as a white person with your work, no matter how relevant and important it is, could, stunt that momentum in some way. And so just seeing you step back and say, that's not my territory to address, and then at the same time using your platform to offer information about organizations to support and fundraisers and calling legislators, just seemed to me like the kind of work that me as a white curator as well, I'm doing at this moment. So thank you for diving into those politics and content around the work. I think it's important, even if it's can be difficult or uncomfortable to discuss. If we go back a couple of slides, Elizabeth, I wanted to now just, by way of conclusion, ask how the wild within fits into your larger practice, Rachel, because there are some people on this Zoom call who might not know your other works. So does it continue themes and bodies of work that you've already begun? Does it indicate a new direction?
Yeah, I mean, so as you can see from the images that we're looking at now, working at a large scale and working with space has always been part of my practice. I think what has been the central challenge and excitement about this work is working with such a heavy material and in such a non-modular way, which, the piece on the right, which I created for Airbnb Seattle, is all, it looks unified, but there are all these tiny modular elements that I can just lift myself. So in certain ways, working at that scale with that material, which is rope, is a lot easier. So, I think this work was expanding a part of my practice, these stone and cast concrete elements, which are really heavy and hard to manipulate, and making them incredibly large. So it feels to me like this wonderful fusion of these two sides of my practice. And was also a way for me to continue working in stone. If you go ahead one slide, you'll see these installation projects that I've done with obsidian, which is the stone that I'm obsessed with. And there are all of these tied together boulders that create this sort of vulnerability inducing tumbling pile. And so for me, this was a way to kind of work with that same feeling and the same type of engagement with the viewer, but through a different means. I hope that there will be other pieces like this. I mean, for me, working in an outdoor venue and having the opportunity to have the work be in conversation with other sculptures in the park was a really amazing opportunity. I mean, I feel so blessed and excited to have, works by Maren Hassinger and Letha Wilson, you mentioned Aaron Curry, like all of these folks who are sort of looking on and in conversation with my work. So that was a really new opportunity for me as well. Yeah, so I hope there are other opportunities to work at this scale. I feel like now that I have this gigantic 10-foot mold, the possibilities are limitless.
Yeah, and that segues nicely to my last question, but I also just wanted to emphasize for those of you who are watching who haven't seen Rachel's, haven't viewed Rachel's work in person, that there's something like energetically very special about her attention to surface textures that she's spent hours upon hours sanding and refining these surfaces to have this very elegant sort of visually confusing almost surface textures. So they really need to be seen in person, although these are beautiful photographs as well. And then to wrap up, I just wanted to ask, so you have this impressive list of public and private commissions, but working with a museum was new for you. Is there anything about the experience that was different from working solo or with a private client?
This was an incredibly rewarding experience for me. And I think, we talked a lot about the ways in which the ideas morphed and developed over the course of the sculpture's creation. And that would not have been possible working for, doing a commission for an individual or for an organization. And working in particular with you, Sam, we had hours of conversations and sort of difficult slogging through ideas to get to this place, and having that kind of support and receptivity to the development of the work was priceless. And you added so much through your research and sharing of resources that it was absolutely invaluable and just like educative and wonderful, and has opened up all these other possibilities and directions for future sculptures as well. So I think the biggest difference in working with an institution was just that you created space for that kind of growth. And also, as I mentioned, I think being in the company of such, heavy hitters, such amazing sculptors really set the bar very high for me, and made this a very landmark sort of milestone experience in my own career.
It was a pleasure for all of us to work with you, Rachel, and I also learned so much, and I have so much more to continue thinking and researching about based on this piece, which will continue to live on in the park for at least a year. And now I would like to open it up to the audience. Elizabeth, are there any questions?
Yes, let me take a look. So our first question from Paul, he asks, why concrete instead of another material such as metal or resin? It seems more risky of breakage.
So this is a good question. Let me address the second part. So the concrete that I use is fiberglass reinforced, and then this piece actually has a chopped fiberglass core, so concrete mixed with a lot of fiberglass to sort of give it that internal structure that rebar would typically provide, but which it can't because of the curvy, flexible nature of the forms that I use. But I am exploring currently in the studio working with cast foam, despite having resisted for so long. I think part of my attraction to concrete has always been its ubiquity and its sort of alignment with these. It's a traditional building material. It's got this like brutalist, heavy, masculine identity, and so I can soften it and bend that in the forms in which I'm pushing it into. So that's been the appeal. But there are other materials that I'm dabbling with at the moment.
Great. And then another question is this a self-portrait or any of your other fold pieces?
I think to a certain degree, they're all, to a certain degree, they're all self-portraits, because I think I spend a lot of time in my mind. I mean, I mentioned I was a psychology major. I studied psychology in college, and and I'm married to a psychologist. Still an interest. But ultimately, I think the human condition is something that could be more broadly felt and expressed through the work. And I hope that they can, by exploring my own mental place, can speak to a larger human condition.
Great. And then John Ravenel, our artistic director, he actually had a question as well. He asked, was there anything unexpected in the process of making this piece for a specific location and that you may apply to future work?
So interesting. I mean, I think thinking about working outside was really, it was just a really different experience, and that's where I learned so much from the installation team at deCordova, because that's an area that I'm not familiar with, so I got to find out about ground remediation and how to kind of support the work and how to move the work, and that was really exciting. But it's interesting. I mean, when we were placing the work, which I sort of did virtually with Sam and Ross, deCordova's preparator, I had this vision in my mind that it would be sort of set askew. The fold itself is sort of set askew on the plinth, and I always like things to be like a little bit tweaked and off and kind of sort of precarious. And so I was like, oh, it can't be parallel between those two trees. Like, it's got to be, off at an angle. And Sam and Ross were right. It looked much better situated right in the middle and perfectly parallel. So, I think, to answer your question the long way, John, I think that, I and other artists kind of have these rules to live by that we develop, these sort of lessons that we've learned, which we think are sort of all applicable in any scenario. And that rule about precarity and sort of things being askew is one that doesn't always apply. So I will take that knowledge into future installations.
And then another question from Jeffrey. He loves the colors of the work and the photographs, and he wants to know more about, can you describe the colors for those who haven't seen it and why you chose those colors?
Yeah, so the colors of the work are terracotta, black, this sort of like sandy orange, and pink. And I really didn't know what the colors were going to be until pretty close to casting. A lot of the previous folds that you've seen are this sort of marbly pale and darker gray, kind of like this piece that's beside me here. And I like working in that palette, or that grayscale palette, because I can really push the material confusion element and have the pieces really read like stone. But, as per our conversation earlier, I really wanted to move away from aligning the work with historical marble sculpture. And so I wanted to choose colors that were going to read like stone. I thought that terracotta really has this almost clayey, stone-like quality, but then also kind of have like a certain vibrancy and life to them. And the black, I thought, like kind of brought the boulder into the same realm as the folds. Like, it kind of made it so that is it sitting on top of it? Is it originating from it? So yeah, that's sort of how I chose the colors. But as Sam knows, I did so many tests. I did like 25 tests and over the course of a couple of days, and mixed a bunch of different combinations. So it also just came from, this very artistic feeling place of just, what am I drawn to? What seems right?
Sorry, can I just interject really quickly? When I said that Rachel has a masterful control and knowledge of her materials, this is what I'm talking about, that she tested multiple different types of architectural grade concrete, determined the one that worked best for her sculpture, which is in Utah, yeah. And the concrete manufacturer, and then tested every combination of possible colors that could potentially work well together with that concrete to see how it influenced the texture. So just her studio spread out with tons of clumps of concrete samples, polychrome samples. So yeah, intensive processes.
Great. And then another question, what's next for the folds and in your career? Do you have any big projects coming up?
Yeah, I am. So what's next for the folds? I like I said, I'm working in cast foam, and so I'm really excited to explore that more. I also have this like huge boulder, which you might see behind me, which was the alternate for the boulder that's currently sitting in the lap of the Wild Within. So it is very perfectly shaped to stand upright on a flat floor, which I'm excited about. So it will have a home with a new sculpture at some point. And then in my career, I am, for better or worse, going to Seattle at the end of next week to install my largest installation to date. I'm working with the Gates Foundation and their new population health building at the University of Washington. So I'm excited to see that up in the air. And then I've got a little 2-person show with New York-based sculptor Katie Bell at a little gallery called Super Duchess, and that will be open to view at the beginning of September. So that's what's going on.
Elizabeth, did you see the question in the chat?
Oh, no, let me take a look. Oh, yeah. So in Fuseli's, I really don't know how to say that.
Fuseli, yep.
Fuseli's Nightmare, there's a horse. What did it signify, or did you make it a reference to it or omit it? And can you comment more on weight versus weightlessness in your work?
Yeah.
Love that.
So there is a horse. It is the the literal mare and the nightmare. Maybe you're better equipped to answer that question, Sam, because I'm blanking right now. I did do a lot of research on the significance of the horse. It is sort of a misnomer, as the nightmare. The actual nightmare is the imp which sits on the woman's chest, but what is the significance of the horse kind of peeking through that red curtain?
There were some series of horses accompanying the incubus, like the incubus riding on a horse to come give the bad dream to the person, sleeper, but most Fuseli scholars actually counter that it is totally literal. It is literally just a nightmare, like mare meaning horse, it's nighttime, it's a nightmare. And so it's this totally dumb, literal, obvious pun, basically, is what most scholars most recently have decided. And Rachel and I have talked a lot about, like, with abstraction, how literal to be. Like, everything can symbolize something else, but if everything has this one-to-one significance, then it actually is depleted of all of its poetry. And so I don't know, Rachel, if you were thinking about the horse, but just now I was being too literal probably in my interpretation, but I was thinking of the horse as like, when I view the sculpture, I feel like the horse peeking in as the viewer, like as this voyeur sort of. But now I'm getting all kinds of programming ideas to bring a horse to the park.
Yeah, I mean, I could ride that horse. I grew up riding horses, so
that's what it is. Okay.
Out of it. Yeah, I mean, and of course, a mare is a female horse specifically. So that's in a very, sort of an interesting symbol there. And I also just wanted to speak to the second part of the question. Can I comment more on weight versus weightlessness? This is just I think so much of my work is about various types of tension between and among elements and various power dynamics that exist among elements, especially in some of my smaller sculptures where elements are sort of tied together or pulling on one another, or there's like a frame encasing something that then, you know, pierces through the frame. And here, this piece is no different. In ways that I had both planned and not planned, this 4,000 almost pound sculpture really appears to levitate, and, you know, giving it this sort of flat butt or base to sit on gave it this sense that the stone was almost like punching through this piece of folding cloth. So it really has, and the stone itself, which just happened to be the stone that came to me from this quarry very fortuitously, it is sort of perched there on the lap of the fold with these 3 points. And so there's this huge negative space underneath it where it seems to like kind of levitate or hover above the fold. And so that element, kind of back to the beginning of our discussion, of really undermining people's expectations about materials and getting the physical world to kind of bend in ways that we don't expect. You know, that's definitely an intentional part of the work. And then through the cosmic forces that came into creating the piece ended up being really amplified in ways that I hadn't intended.
And that same person also was wanting to know more about the poem you referred to, just the title and name, and if you have any other thoughts about it.
I think the title of the poem is actually the title of the painting, is it not? It's The Nightmare, Henry Fuseli, 1781, and the poet's name is Paul Tran. And it is an incredible poem, which I think even reading it wouldn't do it justice, because part of what makes it incredible in my mind is the way that the poet sort of splits and breaks words and the sort of structure of the poem. And by kind of breaking words, they allow them to have these dual meanings. So I would very much suggest seeking that poem out. I love it.
Paul Tran is an amazing poet, and actually Rachel and I reached out to them, and they gave permission for us to adapt their poem for the title, and we're really, really thrilled that this sculpture in particular was seen as embodying this sort of gender non-binary notion of intimacy.
And then maybe our last question for now, unless we have time after, is Paul was wondering, is the height of the plinth decided because of accessibility for viewers to look and touch?
Partly, yes. For the most part, the dimensions of the elements were, you know, I thought that the proportions worked well in previous pieces. So largely the dimensions were simply amplified and the proportions retained. But I think that I think that the sort of top edge of the sculpture comes to like 78 inches or something. It's about 6'6". So it kind of meets in the eye or looks slightly down upon most viewers. And I really like that sense of tension, especially because the weight is so visceral. So there is this element of precarity that I really like about it, where you're kind of meeting this other being that's very weighty and, you know, maybe it looks like it could fall, but there's this sort of eye-to-eye interaction, if you will, that happens. And so I think that yes, for that reason, and just so that it could be accessible and visible from, you know, and Sam was so great in helping me to think about these things, just how is the sculpture going to read from far away, and how is it going to sort of entice viewers toward it?
And even though our sculptures withstand tough New England winters, our human hands do leave oils that can damage the sculptures. So there's actually no touching of any of the sculptures on our campus, with very, very few exceptions, but especially now during the coronavirus, which will be especially frustrating, I'm sure, around Rachel's sculpture. I don't even want to evoke what dinging it does, but yeah, but very tactile in that way. I think unless there's some last burning question, I think that this is a perfect place to wrap up with the reminder of no touching. Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your insights into your work. Elizabeth, thank you for reading the questions. Thank you everyone for joining us today. You know, Rachel, this is just such a proud collaboration. I think it checks all of the boxes of what the platform series is supposed to do. It pushes the boundaries of contemporary sculpture. It offers support to an artist at a really exciting, pivotal moment in their career. So everyone go check out Rachel's website, and please buy a ticket online in advance to come visit the sculpture in person at deCordova.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam.